Okay, thanks again, Daphne, for that great introduction. So John, Aaron, and I are here today to walk you all through what lies ahead. And we're going to start off today by talking about where we are currently with our updated forecast. John is going to introduce and talk about the second annual Engineering and Design Services Industry Forecast. And then we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the data I gathered for the Research Institute in the inaugural edition of the Engineering Business Sentiment Study. And Erin's going to contribute her private market data to the discussion as well. As Daphne said, if you have questions and comments, please feel free to post those in the chat. We'll try to address those as possible during the presentation. So John, I'm going to turn it over to you to start us off with the Engineering and Design Services forecast.
Great, thank you, Joe. Welcome, everyone. As Joe said, I'm going to take about maybe 10 minutes here to sort of set things up by talking about our new outlook for the industry. So we're looking at with this study how the industry is actually impacting the economy at large, but also what the economic setup looks like for the industry itself and where we see things heading over the next few years here. So before we sort of break out the crystal balls and start talking about the future and where we see things headed, I want to start just reviewing some historic numbers, specifically looking at last year, at 2020, and how the industry performed relative to 2019. So these are some of our top line numbers that come out of our study. You can see here that industry sales in 2020 totaled $338 billion. So to put that in perspective, that is roughly the size of the entire economy of Denmark. So a really tremendous amount of revenue is generated by the industry. You can see here that we did see a decline of 7.2% in revenue or industry sales last year. This probably is not surprising to anyone on this call. We know what we went through the pandemic, with a lot of projects being delayed and a lot of economic activity that was pushed off, frankly, until in this year, 2021. So we saw a pretty significant decline. That 7.2% was right on par with what we were expecting in last year's outlook. As you might expect, with the 7.2% decline in revenue, we also saw a similar decline in the contribution, the economic contribution of the engineering and design services industry, and a similar decline in the tax revenue, federal, state, and local tax revenues that were collected based on industry activity. But one of the most interesting things to me with this slide and with the findings, looking at a review of last year, is what's happened on the employment side of things, right? So if you look at that direct employment supported by the industry at 1.5 million full and part-time jobs, that was down just 1.2% on that 7.2% decline in revenue. And even stronger yet is what's happened on the wage front. So you can see average wages actually grew nearly 4% as sales were declining 7.2%. So this is really sort of unprecedented performance. And I think it speaks to the fact that you all as firms within the industry were anticipating this to be a short-term downturn, and that there was going to be a snapback. And that makes sense. You wouldn't want to lay off workers and have to go back out into the labor market and try and rehire people if you expect revenue to rebound rather quickly. So, if you contrast this with, the recession that we saw back in 2009. So following the Great Recession, there was about a 9% drop in industry sales and about an 8% drop in employment. It took about 8 or 9 years to recover those pre-recessionary employment levels. This is very different than that. So we've experienced a recession, but we're not seeing the impact on employment. And we've seen a much shorter, quicker snapback. So let's dig into the economic impact numbers a little bit deeper here. So you can see industry revenue, $338 billion, as I just mentioned, in 2020. That translated to $518 billion in economic contribution. This is what we refer to as the multiplier effect when we're doing economic impact or economic significance studies. So for every dollar that was spent across engineering and design services, there was about $1.50 that was generated in GDP in the US. And if you draw your attention to that third column, you can see how that GDP or how that multiplier effect sort of works here. So that $338 billion in industry revenue led to $198 billion of value added, direct value added. And so that's the value added that accrues directly to engineering and design services firms. But you can see below that, there was also an additional $321 billion in value added in what we call the indirect and induced impacts. And the indirect impacts, those represent all the impacts to the supply chain of engineering and design services. So all the purchases that you all make as engineering and design services firms, whether that's on materials or on services, those all accrue to the US economy in some fashion as well. The induced impact is the impact of respent wages. So across the engineering and design services firms, everyone's paid a salary. Those salaries are then respent in the US economy on the things that we all spend on every day. That is the ripple effect of the industry. At the bottom, you can see a total of 4.7 million jobs supported by the industry. I mentioned 1.5 million direct jobs. This 4.7 also represents those indirect and induced jobs as well. And then last year, we saw over $100 billion in federal, state, and local tax collections were derived from economic activity within the industry. So let's start to look forward here. This is our actual forecast. What we're forecasting here is economic output or total revenue within the industry. So again, you will see there in 2020 that $337.8 billion in industry revenue was generated. And you can see what happens in 2021. We've got a relatively sharp snapback. And here is that sort of anticipation that it was a relatively sharp recession. We saw that workers weren't laid off, and there's good reason because we have rebounded. It's a good thing that a lot of these workers weren't laid off, or firms would really be struggling to replace that labor now. That rebound has been led by mostly by residential construction has driven the outperformance in 2021. But we've also seen some segments across commercial, like digital infrastructure being built. We've seen a lot of warehouses being built, and it's helped to fuel this. So overall, we're expecting an 8.1% increase in output across the industry in 2021. And you can see across the bottom, those growth rates. We expect that growth to continue all the way through the forecast horizon into 2026. But that growth does start to slow. So 3.2% growth next year. We expect it to slow all the way down to about 1.8% by the time we hit 2026.
So John, I've got a quick question for you here. Does that include the infrastructure bill, or how will the infrastructure bill that's been recently passed affect this forecast?
Okay, very well-timed question. So thank you, whoever asked that question. The answer is no, it does not. Our baseline forecast, when we were first conducting this work, it was in the midst of the deliberation around the infrastructure package. We all suspected that something would pass, but we didn't really know what exactly that was going to look like. And so the Research Institute had the foresight to have us do some scenario analysis around the various different infrastructure plans that were being rolled out. And so we had done a lot of that work before we developed the baseline forecast. So when we did have a bill that passed, we were able to quickly take that model that we built and apply it to our baseline forecast to look at the impact of that additional infrastructure spending. And so this slide here, the chart on the left, helps to illustrate what we found in doing that scenario analysis and analyzing the $550 billion infrastructure bill that has been passed. And you can see here, the blue line in this chart represents revenue or output in our baseline forecast. And the purple line represents our new scenario analysis or our forecast that includes all of that infrastructure spending. So we expect over the 5-year period of our forecast that $550 billion in additional infrastructure spend will translate into roughly $132 billion in additional revenue or output across the engineering and design services industry. So this represents about 5.5 or 5.6% in annual increases above and beyond what our baseline forecast was. Additionally, we expect there to be 82,000 jobs over the forecast period that will be supported by the infrastructure plan, and about $62 billion in wages. So it really is a big boon for the industry, and it represents tremendous upside to our forecast. So we are extremely optimistic about the direction of the industry and the industry's growth over the next couple of years. With that said, any good economist has to temper the optimism by tossing just a little bit of water on our expectations and talk about some of the things that we're keeping an eye on that represent key risks to our forecast. So some of these risks are downside risks, some of them are upside risks. But I would say, now that infrastructure is passed, the risks that we're looking at really tilt towards the downside. So there are some things, despite this really rosy forecast that we have, that we're keeping an eye on over the next couple of years. And we're going to dig into these in a little bit more detail as we go through, and Joe and Erin. Joe talks about sentiment and Erin talks about what she's seeing in private markets. But just to do a quick review of some of the things that we're keeping an eye on. Obviously, COVID-related headwinds, that 7.2% decline that we saw last year was all due to the impact of the pandemic, the initial shocks of the pandemic. So we're obviously keeping a close eye on what's happening now, in particular with Omicron and the direction that that's going. We're still all waiting for the medical community to give us a little bit more information about what the epidemiological impact of this is going to be, and how that might translate into impacts to the economy and to the industry.
John, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I know we're going to hit on some of these other areas, but I do have a question for you before we move on to the next section, just in terms of timing here. The question is, do you expect that there will be any additional shutdowns? Should there be additional flare-ups in the pandemic? Is that going to cause any more disruptions? What's the official forecast on that?
Yeah, it's a good question, Joe. And so it's obviously something to say with certainty, right? That we live in a very uncertain time with the pandemic and trying to understand the direction of all of these things. But we think that the most likely scenarios that we're not going back to shutdowns. I mean, there's no real will among state, local, or federal officials to shut down economies. I think, all of the data that we see from consumers, they're not ready for it. None of us want to go back to shutdown mode, and I think that's going to be a worst case scenario. So I think there's always the possibility that something comes out of left field. Obviously, we've seen vaccination rates rise. All of this helps us have a little bit more certainty moving forward. So yeah, that could happen again, but we definitely don't think that's the most likely scenario.
All right, great. Well, thanks, John, so much for giving us this overview. I know we're going to talk with you a little bit more as we go through the rest of this presentation, but I think it's pretty safe to say that the industry has fully recovered as a whole. And I'm going to go through a few of the slides that I have from the sentiment index that we just created. This is our inaugural sentiment study. We surveyed about 500 firms within the industry, and they gave us their feedback on both current and future outlook for their firms, as well as the industry as a whole, and what they think is happening with the US economy. So one thing I want to point out here is that there's extremely positive sentiment right now. This is current economic sentiment. So almost 9 out of 10 firms said that they have a very positive outlook right now regarding their firm's the finances. Sorry. And if you look at the right-hand side, I'm going to refer to the net rating. And this is also something that as we continue to produce additional waves of this data, we're going to start tracking these net ratings to see how the sentiment is moving over time and into the future. So you'll see that 84% at the top. What that means is it's 88% positive minus the 4% negative. You can't get much better current sentiment than we have right now. You will see that the overall sentiment in the terms of the US economy is less positive, but it's still overwhelmingly positive right now. We see that larger firms are more positive than smaller firms. And we also see some regional differences. Those firms that are located in the Northeast and the West are less positive, but again, still very positive, just relatively less positive than those in the South and the Midwest. So this is good news overall with these few differences.
Right. So a couple thoughts on this, Joe. So one of the data points that some members of our audience know that we track carefully is the Census Bureau's Quarterly Services Index. So this sort of by our NAICS code, for engineering and architecture shows us that we have recovered, from our pandemic caused recession. So in Q2 and Q3 of this year, we came back up to Q4 2019 levels. And Q4 2019 was our strongest quarter that we've ever had. 2019 was the strongest year that we'd had as an industry. A couple of other thoughts on the sentiment survey. So what's interesting about maybe smaller firms being less positive, in some of our discussions as an industry, we think that this may be attributed to smaller firms having a little bit more of a cash crunch as a result of the pandemic, and maybe what I would term as a PPP loan hangover, sort of not many, if not most of our small member firms did take out PPP loans. And there's been some concern about what that will mean and the ramifications, which we're obviously working through as an industry now. The other thing, and we're going to get into this a little bit more in an upcoming slide, is those regional differences. The US is a huge country, and some of the headwinds and some of the growth that we're seeing has been very much concentrated in the Sun Belt region of the US. So it'll be interesting to take a deeper look into that as well.
Yeah. So we also have from the sentiment study specific market sector sentiment. We asked overall, are you positive or negative or neutral towards the markets within these various areas? And what we see was really interesting. We see that data centers, water, wastewater, healthcare facilities, utilities and telecommunications, the current sentiment is extremely positive for these. And these really are the areas that have been a focus during the pandemic. These are not areas that are necessarily going to be the growth areas going forward. And we're going to contrast this slide to another slide about in a few minutes that we have looking at future sentiment. But I think we do see here also, Erin, there's residential land development near the top. And I know you're going to talk about that in just a minute. But I want to show the other slide, the second half of this list, and we'll see those sectors that are underperforming, although again, still positive net ratings, but those areas that are underperforming are commercial real estate, which obviously has been impacted by the pandemic, and then convention centers, all these places where we gather in mass. So, these are areas that have clearly been affected during the pandemic by us distancing and having to deal with the effects of the pandemic. Absolutely.
Human behavior actually does drive the design of our infrastructure. And of course, I was very pleased to see all those private markets at the top, since those are the markets that I concentrate on. But as Joe said, those are really the markets, the ones at the top that we really needed during the pandemic, including data centers, industrial warehouse as part of commercial real estate and so forth. So this slide that I'm showing you all compares the construction put in place, which includes both design and construction spending, 2020 over 2019. And John shared with us some details on sort of annual comparisons, but I wanted you all to see this so you could see the kind of residential growth that we saw year over year versus non-residential private, which is, all of those sort of office, hotel, and other spaces, as well as public. So what we saw in 2020 during the pandemic recession was really that residential sort of, kept us at those peak numbers, while we saw a decline in commercial real estate and other non-residential sectors. And then public, we saw sort of a slow growth over that. Now, when we compare year over year, this year versus last year, 2020, for the months, we have data through the months of October right now, we see some of these trends changing a little bit. So we see incredible residential growth. So, the residential sector is about 70% single family, new single family. So that's about 24%. And remember, in 2020, it was up from 2019. So that's incredible growth. This is key for our firms that do land development, as home builders are their primary client, but it's also key for our member firms that do a lot of what I call community infrastructure. So, water, wastewater plants, secondary roadways, K through 12 schools, et cetera. The kind of infrastructure that is necessary to support single family neighborhoods. What we also saw, obviously, was, we're seeing not as bad of a decline in our commercial private number, the non-residential number, but we're seeing a dip, from 2020 to 2021 in that public number. Now, that dip really comes from that lack of, that tightening of the belt for our states and our counties that can't run deficits, as they got nervous last year during the pandemic. And we're optimistic that we will see that public number trend back up, as we've had quite a bit of federal stimulus, not just with the infrastructure package, but with the stimulus activities this past spring with the CARES Act and some of the other federal legislation.
I think what's really interesting, Erin, is with that, the private markets and the residential. So I live in a very rural area, and my road only has a handful of houses, in a 1 mile stretch. And in the last year, we've gotten 2 brand new houses built, and there haven't been any houses built on this road in 20 years. So, we certainly see it even out in I think it's evident in the rural as well as the suburban areas.
Absolutely. So, it's interesting because when you're tracking this data, you can't wait for the census. So, we have to look at all sorts of other different data points. One data point that we look at are permits issued, for new privately owned housing units. So, this chart that you're looking at is really a snapshot from July of 19, before the pandemic, all the way in a 2-year block to this past summer in 2021. So what we sort of see is that there was a dip, as you can see in the middle, when the pandemic first started, and then it rose back up and it sort of peaked in January of 2021, right about, and those were the kind of numbers that we hadn't seen since the housing boom in May of 2006. And then it sort of slowed down a little bit. Now, demand is still there. So we think that slowdown that we're seeing in 2021 is attributed to supply chain constraints for home builders. Lumber was the most impacted material, as well as supply constraints regarding land and regarding even simple things like appliances for kitchens, has really had an effect on the residential market. But the demand is still there. And then, I sort of isolated the 4 different census regions so we could see where that growth was actually happening. So the growth is really happening in the Sun Belt. The South region for the census basically goes from what we would consider the mid-Atlantic, sort of the Delaware, Maryland area, all the way down through about Arizona. And then in the Midwest, I was kind of surprised to see that that's growing at about 20% in this 2-year time frame as well. And then we're seeing much slower growth in the Northeast and in the West. And what this is really attributed to is affordability, right? If you have more flexibility and you're going to move or to migrate, you're most likely, you may want to move or migrate to areas of the country where you can afford more house.
Aaron, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you
ahead.
off. I think this is really interesting to me because, we conducted our sentiment survey of firms, which is a completely separate set of individuals than any data that you have from your private markets. And we see that the sentiment in the Northeast and West is less optimistic. It's still very strong, but it correlates here with what you're seeing in the residential area. Is there a tie between what we're seeing with the firm sentiment due to residential, sluggishness in the Northeast and West?
Absolutely. I mean, if you're in a land development practice, or you're just doing engineering and you have a growing population, you're feeling much better, except for maybe your labor constraints, which we'll talk about in a minute. But, business is booming for so many of our firms that are in these growing geographic markets. So, one of the fun things to also look at is sort of what I call alternative data points, to sort of reinforce our more traditional data points like permits issued. And one of them is the U-Haul migration trends, and so this is basically like, for people that rent a U-Haul one way, where do they drop it off? And looking at the top 10 states, we can see it reinforces what we saw in the growth of the Sun Belt and a little bit in the Midwest. We've got Ohio coming in at number 4. And that sort of reinforces some of that information about what parts of the US are growing.
So I've got a really quick question here for John that's just come in from one of our audience members. John, the question has to do with inflation. With all of this growth that we're anticipating, and the great news on the housing market and the infrastructure bill having been passed, are we going to see significant inflation, and is that going to impact the industry and the forecast?
Well, yeah, it's a funny question, Joe, right? So we all know that the Fed sort of backtracked on this idea of temporary or transitory inflation, right? And now there's an admission that there is some more permanent inflation out there. And it's something that we had anticipated when we went through the forecast, right? I mean, you can't throw the amount of stimulus at our economy that we've had. You have more dollars chasing less goods and services, you're going to have prices rise, right? And we also see the labor shortage issues, which is driving wages higher. The wages translate into higher prices. So all of those things are driving inflation. Now, there are some more temporary measures of inflation, and those are the ones that Aaron alluded to with some of the material costs going up, right? So we think that by the time we get into next year, later next year, we're going to have less issues with things like lumber prices that spiked early on, steel prices that came later. All of these things are basically a result of the pandemic, right? And so there's been a chain of events that have caused a lot of these bottlenecks. But that part of inflation is transitory. So we don't expect to continue to see double, even triple digit rises, right, in material costs. But there is going to be some additional inflation. And frankly, that's one of the reasons when we looked at the baseline forecast that we start to see growth rates taper off towards the end, because what's the Fed going to have to do to deal with inflation? They're going to have to raise rates, right? So interest rates are going up over the next couple of years, which means less economic growth, and which means, there is going to be, some impact in the long run, or in the medium run, I should probably say, on the industry.
And I'm sure that's going to have some effect on the housing market as well, because we know it's very sensitive to mortgage rates. And Aaron, you mentioned something a little bit ago about how the housing market, we haven't seen this level of growth since the bubble of 2005.
Right. No,
2006.
don't say bubble.
So, how, if at all, is this like 2005 and 2006? Are we in another bubble here?
We're not in another bubble. So, one of the reasons we're not in a bubble is, the finance industry, the banking industry did correct a lot of those issues connected to the subprime mortgage crisis. So one of the other reasons that we're not in a bubble, which, really, when you look back at the last 100 years in the US, is that a lot of our infrastructure growth and our housing growth is about demographics. And so the millennial generation is a very large generation, larger than our Generation X, and so those oldest millennials are not kids anymore. They are, entering their 40s, and they are buying homes. And if they already owned maybe a starter home or a condo, they had to go through the pandemic, remote working, maybe they have young children, and now they're going to come live, in a rural environment with you, Joe, on your street, so yeah. They are looking for more space, right? And some of this is natural because of the age they are, and some of it is the result of the pandemic, and it is reinforced by low interest rates. So really, there's a few reasons for that. Now, certainly if interest rates go up, we're going to see housing slow down a little bit, but when it's 25% almost year over year, the slowdown it's still going to be a significant growing market. So that will be really interesting and really key. And, I think that we can all agree that the future continues to look pretty bright as a result.
Yeah, I was just going to say that. You took the words right out of my mouth. I think based on the information John has shared with us with the forecast, based on current sentiment, based on your private market data, everything is pointing in the right direction. So let's take a little bit closer look at what we're expecting in the future in terms of the sentiment of those in the industry. Again, this is from almost 500 firms who provided us with their outlook on the industry, as well as their firm, as well as the condition of the U.S. economy. And we still see that future forward-looking sentiment within the industry is very, very positive. It's not as positive as the current sentiment, but there's almost nowhere to go up. So it's going to have to moderate a little bit going forward. But these are still extremely strong numbers when you have a 48% positive net rating and a 40% positive net rating. What I think is interesting, and this probably plays into some of those headwinds John has mentioned that are potential issues looking forward, is the condition of the U.S. economy. Again, this is much less positive, and it's almost at even here, although slightly positive. So I think this is something to look out for as we continue to conduct this survey going forward. And we still see that those larger firms are much more optimistic relative to smaller firms. And we also see that the firms in the West aren't quite as optimistic as others in other areas of the country, but still really good news here going forward overall. And when we look at the specific market sectors, this is really interesting, Aaron and John. We see here looking forward, the top market segments in terms of optimism are transportation, both roads and bridges, and transit, and even a little further down with airports. We still see water and wastewater up there. Energy and utilities is at the top. And what's I think this is telling us is, and this was taken before the passage of the infrastructure bill, but this is looking at a anticipated passage of the infrastructure bill, and these areas are now rising to the top.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is very, our members clearly had a lot of faith in our ability, our advocacy group's ability to help pass this bill, and we did. And so, the sentiment is no longer just really, really strong in those sort of pandemic related markets like data centers and residential, but it really is showing that we expect, some of the publicly funded markets like transportation, water, wastewater, which is 90% public, and airports, et cetera, to be the ones that are growing, in the future. And that growth will be nationwide. So we might see some changes, I think, in upcoming surveys. And, the West has a water crisis that hopefully the infrastructure bill will help resolve. The Northeast has an incredible aging infrastructure, since it's really some of the oldest infrastructure in the US. And so I think that we may see some positivity in some of those areas looking forward as well.
Yeah, I do have a question from the audience here that I want to throw out real quick before we address this next slide. But one individual asks that it looks like the sentiment is between the engineering industry and the U.S. economy as a whole are decoupled, is their word. And I think that's exactly right. And I think a big reason for that is the infrastructure bill that's passed. I'm not sure we would see such sterling optimism going forward had people not anticipated the passage of the infrastructure bill. So I think that's definitely something at play. And then as we just moved to this slide, we see again, still at the bottom of the list are convention centers and then courthouses and corrections facilities. So clearly we're still seeing a hangover, along with commercial real estate, a hangover from the pandemic in terms of where we're gathering in real, in commercial buildings. But Aaron, I thought it was really interesting to see this courthouses and corrections at the bottom, both in current sentiment and future. Do you have any thoughts on that one?
Yeah. So that's interesting, because that is community infrastructure that often, and it is public. One of the reasons that I think is really interesting, and again, this goes to sort of, human behavior and how our society is, the kind of conversations we're having as a society, is that there has been a little bit of a rethinking about justice and corrections facilities, overall, and including within the AE market. And that seems to be the result of conversations that we're having after the George Floyd murder in 2020 and the protests that resulted, and also conversations about, whether or not public-private partnerships should be involved in this market and how they should be involved in this market. So I think that this might be less about funding streams in many ways, or a little bit about funding streams, but also about a conversation that society is having, which is pretty interesting. And, our behavior is changing in other ways. One of the reasons we're seeing some of the commercial real estate is, working in an office and traveling for work, being in hotels, and sort of that kind of business spending might remain down as we all sort of adjust to the virtual world, such as doing presentations like this that we just didn't do before the pandemic. So
yeah, I think it's fascinating when you look at this in a broader context, that the engineering industry does not live in isolation. It's affected by everything that's going on in the world around us. Well, of course, everyone felt the pandemic, but we see again, as you just mentioned, in the areas of the courthouses and corrections, how social issues, economic issues, political issues all have an impact on this industry. I've got a quick question for you, John, that's come through the chat before we move on to some more of Aaron's private market data slides. And I don't know if you can answer this, but I think it's an interesting question. How has the semiconductor chip shortage impacted the engineering outlook, or do you think it will impact the outlook?
Well, semiconductors obviously have been at the top of the list, and one of the things that has been significantly, supply constrained. And so from that perspective, yes, semiconductors go into everything, right? I mean, we are a digital economy. And so I think just generally speaking, we have to make sure that we get supply chains moving again to get the economy and the industry going. But as I mentioned before, we look at this as a short-term shock. There are a number of reasons for it, again, mostly pandemic related, that we expect to smooth out as we get into next year. So we don't see a big impact. Obviously, it's a headwind, as are the supply shocks we've seen with construction materials. But we don't think of it as something that's going to have a tremendous impact on where we're going over the next couple of years.
Okay, well, that's definitely good news. And I will say, I just got my pots and pans I ordered in June, so I'm feeling a little bit better today. And maybe some of those supply chain issues are starting to iron themselves out. So let's keep our fingers crossed. A real quick note here. Someone asked, what is the net rating? I know some people joined at the top of the hour. Again, that net rating is taking the positive, the green, and subtracting the negative or red sentiment. And that's where you get the net rating. So you see where the overall balance is tilting. All right, Erin, I know you've got a few more data slides for us. So what are you seeing looking forward?
Well, as many of our members know, I analyze 4, now 5, because we just added education, key private markets as part of ACEC's initiative to make sure that we're covering all parts of the built environment, not simply transportation or water. So I'm just going to go through a couple of details. Some of this we've already covered through our conversation so far during our panel discussion, but within the commercial and residential real estate market, we've sort of talked about residential. What is really interesting within the commercial real estate market is the strength. Then for like about 10 years running, the strongest market is industrial and distribution warehouses, and obviously that is not the sexiest part of commercial real estate for sure. But again, this really goes to human behavior dictating commercial real estate and infrastructure design. So with e-commerce, it just kept building. And now it's at the point where in most major, especially in port areas and coastal cities in the US, the industrial real estate vacancy rate is hovering at 1%. So, the growth of Amazon, the growth of buying online, the growth and the necessity for cold storage is really transforming commercial real estate in many ways. And then we also are seeing a really big push on obviously net zero goals looking, obviously to 2030 is only 8 years away almost. And, 2040, 2050, many states, localities, big pension companies that own a lot of commercial real estate are wanting to see net zero, building energy usage, carbon emission goals. So that is going to continue. And then we're also seeing some of the second tier cities in the US grow, and some of that we're going to be tracking through different data points moving forward to see how much of that is really anecdotal versus reality. But as people maybe can move from more expensive cities to more affordable cities, we might see that kind of growth. The other market that we wanted to share with you, even though it's not strictly private, is sort of looking at the public sector P3s. We talked a little bit about public safety earlier, the corrections market. And we're going to continue to see growth, certainly in the highway and street market, which is obviously very much supported by the infrastructure package. The other thing that's been really interesting to note is that the education market, and that's why we recently added it as our 5th market that we're analyzing, is larger than office. It is the 3rd largest sector in the whole design and construction industry after transportation and energy and utilities. So we cannot ignore that. So, when you look at a lot of areas of the US, both K through 12 and higher education is just such a significant market for our members. So we recently published a brief a few weeks ago on the education market. I encourage our members to check it out on our website. And that continues to be a growing market as the demographics change and as certain parts of the US grow, to support the single family housing that we're seeing. And also because after the last couple of years, people do not want their children at home anymore. And, many of my friends say fully support the education market.
I can tell you a couple of weeks after the pandemic started and schools had shut down, my daughter, who never wanted to go to school, I mean, she woke up every day saying, I wish I didn't have to go to school today. 2 weeks after we were into the pandemic, she was like, when am I going to be able to go back to school? I think we're all happy about that. So we've talked about a few of these issues, that are possibly going to affect our outlook, possible inflation, and maybe that's not going to be as big an issue as we think, although perhaps in the out years of the forecast, we talked about some of the supply chain issues that we may face, although again, Aaron, you were talking about how the public sector may not be as affected by that, especially with the infrastructure bill. We've talked about COVID and perhaps any issues with that, which we don't think are going to impact the forecast. But the one that I think everyone is talking about, and that I know Aaron and John and I'm hearing a lot of questions about, are what's going to happen with this labor market. In the sentiment survey, we found that firms are hiring. They have been hiring and they are currently hiring. So for instance, 9 out of the 10 firms that we surveyed said that they have at least one position open, and the median number is 5. I think these are really amazing numbers. We haven't asked this question before, but to me, this is pretty astounding. And if you look at the open positions by firm size, some firms have 10% of their workforce represented by open positions. This is, I think, a real, to me, it's a real sort of yellow flag. Like, okay, John, you said we have 82,000 additional jobs each year that are going to be needed in this industry. And right now we're having a lot of trouble hiring as it is. So this is certainly, I think, an issue that is of concern. And we even see it in all regions, although in the Northeast and the Midwest, we are seeing that there are even more open positions than in the West and the South. Aaron, I know you have a few thoughts on this, so I'm going to ask you to address some of these questions first.
So we're a professional services industry. We sell our people. And if we do not have the people, we cannot take advantage of all of this new work. So when I get really excited and I'm talking to our member firms about, the infrastructure bill and the growth of the housing industry and what that may mean as a ripple effect, member firms are like, who am I going to get to do this work? And as a former business development director in our industry for many years, I know how painful it can be to not be able to take advantage of all the opportunities that come our way. So that is definitely a challenge. I think the other thing, that we're going to talk about, and I know that the Research Institute that we're looking at exploring in deeper detail coming up, is what that labor supply means also for wages. In our industry, especially with multi-year contracts and being a competitive industry and with our clients, often, we don't assume that this significant wage growth is going to translate necessarily into a growth in our fees, or what does that look like? And I think that, that's something that as an industry we're going to be grappling with, particularly for firms that are maybe locked into very low escalations or no escalations in the coming years, but knowing that they're going to have to pay more for talent because there's just such a talent shortage. John, did you have anything that you wanted to add?
Yeah, so those are great points, Aaron. I think, the labor issue is one, as Joe mentioned, that is at the top of everyone's minds. It's one of the biggest risks that we see when we look at the forecast, and everybody's asking the question, what are we going to do about this, right? You're hearing it from members. It's like, what's going to give here? And so I can give, for starters, just the sort of economisty answer There might be some eye rolls on the other sides of these screens here with the general answer, but it's, market forces are gonna solve this problem. It might take a little bit of time, but there are market forces at work that will change the labor market, and it will adapt to this. And so what does that mean in terms of market forces? You talked about wages, right? Wages are going to continue to be forced higher, right? It's
Right.
simple supply and demand. We saw as I talked about, even when the industry was in recession, wages went up 4% because of this issue. We've seen wages grow another nearly 5% so far, average wages year to date, and that's going to continue to happen. I think the other thing that will change is really the dynamism of firms and their ability to come up with human resource strategies that help to, support the needs, right? So to support this growth, are there different things that they can do with their current labor or hire or look outside of what they would normally draw from in terms of labor pools?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, that's really interesting because I heard some talk of this at some of our concurrent sessions at our recent fall conference. And we also have some discussions around it in some of our Research Institute meetings. The concept of, when we look at other professional services such as law or even the healthcare services, how, the use, for example, in law firms of paralegals and of administrative staff and,
Right.
how that expands their ability to be able to do work, within the engineering industry. Are there opportunities when you're building a team and you have different kinds of personnel, to hire an urban planner or someone with a business degree or someone to do, specifically project controls and scheduling? How can engineering firms adapt to having to add so many people in order to do the work, but knowing that there aren't a bunch of PEs, there aren't a lot of engineering graduates coming online. So, I think that's really interesting. The other thing, we have a slide up with a few points that are often mentioned, is that it's not just a matter of simple supply and demand and pipeline, but it's also that the pandemic has caused a shift in expectations, right? We've seen a lot of women in our industry. We've really tried to bring on women and other underrepresented groups, within firms and promote them within firms, but we've seen a lot of women exit the workforce or have to maybe scale back a bit because of their child care or elder care responsibilities. And also, when you're competing for talent, how has the work from home environment changed expectations for oncoming employees? And, and really what that comes down to, and this goes back even to what people are trained to do, is a labor market mismatch. And some of that can be about skills, it can be about expectations, and it can even be about geography, as we've touched on before. And so I think, this is probably the beginning of an inflection point for our industry and looking at, this mismatch and how we can continue to grow.
Yeah, and to your point about the pandemic, right? It's not just the engineering and design services industry, but the latest jobs and turnover report showed that we're still 2.4 million, the labor force is 2.4 million people smaller than it was in February of 2020, right? So to your point about childcare and people having to stay home to care for families, there's people with health concerns going back to the office. And so all of those things are impacting it. Just one other quick point, because I know we have to move on here, we're getting close. Technology is another way that firms can really solve this issue. And that's not to say that there's some technology sitting on the shelf that they can just pick up and plug in and replace engineers with tomorrow. But at the margin, there's a lot of productivity gains that can be made by the technological advances that we've seen across the industry. And so this is an area that we've been doing research, with the ACEC Research Institute. We're going to be releasing some of this over the coming weeks. and delving in a little bit more and having a better understanding of how technology is impacting the industry and productivity in the industry, which directly correlates to this issue.
Yeah, so this is, I think, a really good issue, a good topic of discussion. I wish we had more time to talk about it. There's quite a few questions that have come in, and I'm sorry we haven't been able to address all of them, but I did want to share one comment, and I think it goes to this issue here, which is one of our panelists is saying that they're not just having this discussion internally about how are we going to hire enough people and staff appropriately, but they're getting questions from their public sector clients who are asking, are you going to be able to handle the work that we're providing to you? Or is it just going to be this firm trying to get people from this firm? And then, people are just going to be jumping around as the prices go up and wages. So I think it kind of addresses, it's a good, story of both the things that
capacity question in the RFPs is definitely going to be a struggle to answer.
Yeah, exactly. Well, again, I'm sorry we didn't have time to answer all of the questions today, but please feel free to shoot us emails with any questions you might have. And I'm going to turn it back over to Daphne for some closing remarks.
Great. Thanks so much, Aaron, Joe, John. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughtful insights with us. You have given us some great data, a lot of things to think about, and certainly some more discussions to have in the future. I want to give a special shout out to the ACEC Research Institute donors who have made this research and this roundtable possible. And we invite each of you to consider how you and/or your firm might want to support the Institute moving forward. We do have a short evaluation that we'll send you this afternoon, and we would appreciate your sharing your experience with us. And just be sure to join us for our next Future of Engineering Roundtable on January 18th. John alluded to this a little bit. We're going to start a series on technology, and the first one will be the role of technology in engineering services. You can grab your phone real quick and scan that QR code if you'd like. It'll take you right to registration. We'll be sending out some information to you via email as well. So thank you again to our panelists for sharing and for the conversation, for those of you that participated through the chat. And I hope you all have a great afternoon and stay well. Thank you.